This week, we will continue to grapple with America's original sin, slavery. This week, however, we're going to look not just at the institution itself, but instead at the efforts to end it. We'll trace the history of abolitionism from the colonial period through the Civil War to the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. It is tempting to think of the fight against slavery as the fight between a virtuous North and a sinful South, but that is a gross oversimplification. In reality, the abolitionist movement grew in fits and starts. Let's start by taking a look back at slavery during the colonial period. You might recall that the first slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619. While slavery became an integral part of the American economy, it was defended by many, including 12 U.S. presidents who owned slaves themselves. There were always those who spoke out against it. The first group in the American colonies to speak out against slavery, who were not slaves themselves, were the Quakers. Though nearly 70% of the Quakers owned slaves in the late 17th century, church leaders believed that owning slaves was inconsistent with their Christian religious beliefs. So in 1688, Quaker leaders in Germantown, Pennsylvania, issued a statement against the institution of slavery. This was the earliest written record of opposition to slavery in the American colonies. By 1776, Quakers had banned slave owning in their community. And by 1780, it was abolished in the state of Pennsylvania. The Quakers were the most notable example of organized resistance to slavery during the colonial period, but they were not the only ones calling for an end to slavery. Many other Christian denominations argued against the institution. Even some Southern colonial leaders tried to slow or stop the growth of slavery during this time. Some, like Benjamin Franklin, offered economic arguments against slavery, but most who opposed slavery were concerned with the morality of the institution. Throughout the early republic, political compromise was often centered around the institution of slavery. The United States Constitution was able to protect and preserve the institution without ever mentioning the word slave or slavery, perhaps an indication of the mixed feelings about the institution. While many believed it to be wrong, they also thought that ending it would end the new American Union. Thomas Jefferson wrote that maintaining slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. He thought that his cherished federal union, the world's first democratic experiment, would be destroyed by slavery. As a result of this type of thinking, many of America's earliest abolitionist efforts centered on the idea of colonization. In 1816, the American Colonization Society was established with the goal of freeing slaves and returning them to their ancestral home in Africa. The idea was endorsed by President James Monroe and led to the founding of the country of Liberia, with the capital city of Monrovia named in the president's honor. However, to most people, colonization seemed impractical, and most slaves and free blacks opposed the idea. Remember, most slaves at this point had been born and raised in the United States, had no direct connection to Africa. In fact, slaves in many cases had deeper roots in America than many of their white counterparts. By the 1830s, the tone in America was shifting. The religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening were underway, and the abolitionist movement was picking up steam. While abolitionist movements to this point had been relatively conservative and slow-moving, the new militant abolitionist movement was rooted in the firm belief that slavery was morally wrong. It was abhorrent. Abolitionists looked to the Bible and to American founding documents like the Declaration of Independence to make their case that there was no place for slavery in America. In 1829, a black business owner named David Walker published a passionate argument against slavery and racial prejudice. Walker put forward a compelling argument that slavery was anti-religious and anti-American. Though Walker died of tuberculosis just 1 year after publishing his pamphlet, and many believe that he had been poisoned, his work had a lasting impact. In 1831, a white abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison started a newspaper called The Liberator and provided a new and lasting source of inspiration for the militant abolitionists. "I will be as harsh as truth," Garrison announced, "and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Garrison's appeal for the immediate end of slavery, even going so far as to suggest that the Union be dissolved if need be, made clear that the debates over slavery were reaching a fever pitch. The new abolitionists took advantage of the increasing availability of print technology and the increasing literacy rates in America to spread their message. While Garrison was probably the most notable anti-slavery publisher, there were many others who emerged as notable leaders of abolitionism during the antebellum period. Theodore Weld was perhaps the most notable abolitionist preacher who spread the anti-slavery message through impassioned sermons. Former slave Frederick Douglass became the most well-known black abolitionist with a publication of his own called the North Star. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, brought the cruelty of slavery to life for her readers. Southern Sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, were the first nationally known white female abolitionists who also advocated for women's rights, believing the two go hand in hand. In fact, as agitation grew for women's rights, a tension emerged between some abolitionists and women's rights advocates. Eventually, women decided to put more emphasis on ending slavery than securing equal rights for women in the hopes that the rising tide of freedom would benefit them as women as well. They would be sorely disappointed, however, when they were left out of the suffrage amendment that gave former slaves the right to vote in 1870. It'd be another 50 years before women secured the same right for themselves. Although progressive in their views on slavery, white abolitionists couldn't free themselves from the prevailing racial prejudice of their times. Though they worked to free slaves, they often did not trust black abolitionists in positions of power within the movement. Many white abolitionists, though opposed to American acceptance of slavery, were willing to accept racial theories of their time, believing that whites maintained a biological superiority to blacks. Black abolitionists saw the movement as an opportunity to advocate not just for an end to slavery, but for an end to racism. This would prove a bigger challenge, one that we are still reckoning with today. Black abolitionists rejected the idea of America as the land of the free. For example, rather than celebrating July 4th, free blacks created their own freedom celebrations, usually marking January 1st, the date that the slave trade was abolished in America. Frederick Douglass offered a famous rejection of the 4th of July as a freedom celebration with his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" In this speech, Douglass asks, what does the land of the free mean when so many are still in bondage? Who is celebrating the 4th of July? Because it certainly didn't mean freedom for Black American slaves. The rhetoric of the speech is so powerful that it has continued to inspire those who feel as though they have been left out of the American promise of freedom. In our next video, we'll take a brief look at responses to the rise of the abolitionist movement, both in the North and in the South. Thanks for watching.